to appear before you today. Unfortunately, red tape of the reddish kind prevented us from doing it. Basically, it was a problem with obtaining the necessary exit visas to attend.
It's a government cover-up, Philip. Tell them the truth. Tell them the truth.
Nonetheless, we have, I think, an excellent lineup of speakers for you over these next 2 days. Some people have asked me why you've actually termed the conference the name Phantoms of the Sky, and this is where the plug starts. I'm quite fortunate that I work with two, well, I won't make their heads any bigger, but two of my colleagues have at last got their first book on the subject published, and surprise, surprise, it's called Phantoms of the Sky.
It's a cheap and cynical publication.
Of which there are copies available in the foyer.
It looks like this.
Now, isn't that a surprise? I would also like to take a special welcome to some of the delegates who have attended today from various parts of the country. We also have colleagues here from Finland, from Sweden, and from Yugoslavia. And I would like to pay a special thanks for them making this effort. It's nice to have colleagues here from overseas, even though they may not be making a presentation. I'd also like to point out that there's a gentleman stood at the back, looking rather smart, with a camera around his neck. He's our official photographer for the weekend. So if anyone wants any specific photographs taken of one kind or another, this is the gentleman to see. Copies will be made available, and he will organise everything for you. We've also got the opportunity over these next 2 days, if anyone would like to make a UFO report, who have seen something down the years and have never come forward, or perhaps would like to report something that they've perhaps dealt with in the past, there's a sign hastily written on the door over there. There are various signs pointing up the stairs. There's a room set aside for this specific purpose. And surprise, surprise again, in this room we also would like to offer the opportunity for people to actually enrol or subscribe to the Independent UFO Network's magazine, which is named UFO Brigantia, of which we have a special publication just for the conference. It's a double issue. Of course, my colleague on the right, Andy, who's going to be the first speaker today, is also the editor. Now, the programme of today, I hope you've all got one. If not, there are a number of them lying around, is unaltered. We have a number of speakers, starting with Andy Roberts. And unfortunately, David Clark is checking out because he's gone for his graduation at the university today.
Could I just point out that he's in fact just sat in there in front of the projection screen and he's left me to do this talk all by myself.
So the programme is unaltered. The programme for tomorrow has 1 or 2 alterations due to the fact that our colleagues from the Soviet Union couldn't attend. I'll announce those in the morning. But the running order is as is in the programme. And basically we're starting off with my colleague Andy Roberts. This will be followed by a presentation from Peter Hough, the chairman of the Manchester UFO Research Association. We will have a short break, and then we will finish off the evening with Budd Hopkins from the United States. Budd is actually en route from London now, so I hope he arrives in time. Tomorrow, for those that have bought 2-day tickets, we actually start at 11 a.m. So the doors will be open well in hand, and we start at 11 o'clock in the morning. First speaker tomorrow is a lady who's somewhere in the audience, and that's Elsie Wilkinson. I can see Elsie. And she's going to relate one of her own experiences. We will have 1 or 2 alterations to the programme tomorrow. There won't be any people taken out. We'll actually add speakers through the day. I would ask people to be tolerant of some of the views that are about to be expressed over this weekend. The book, Phantoms of the Sky, which Andy will tell you more about later, I'm sure, offers a whole different viewpoint towards the subject. And over these next 2 days, we're going to try and show the people in attendance today that UFOs are not necessarily equals to alien spaceships. We intend to present a wide variety of information from Earthlights, which Mr. Devereux is here in the audience today, from alien abductions. And we'd like to leave you, the audience, to make up your own mind as to the nature and object of the phenomenon. That's enough talking from me. Please avail yourself of the books and magazines that are available in the foyer. Like I say, Phantoms of the Sky is on sale for the very first time. We also have the Gulf Breeze sightings by Edwin Francis Walters on sale for the first time. I'd like to thank you all for attending, and that leaves me with nothing more than to introduce my colleague on my right, Andy Roberts, the editor of UFO Brigantia, and UFO researcher of some repute. Well, so he says anyway.
Ill repute.
Ill repute, yes, that's correct. Andy's going to make the first presentation, and let's give you a nice Sheffield welcome for Andy Roberts. Thank you.
Right, hi, I think someone's going to turn the lights down. Mr. Walmsley, thank you. Right, the reason why I'm speaking first today really is because I'm the boring one, and I'm going to tell you all sorts of things about the UFO phenomenon that you might not possibly like, and hopefully some things that you haven't heard of. This talk's called Phantoms of the Sky, and it is actually based on the research done by the IUN, that's the Independent UFO Network, but specifically myself and David Clark, who've sort of worked together as a research and investigation partnership for 4 or 5 years now. We're not debunkers. You may think that the things I'm going to say debunk the subject, but we're not. We're not believers either. We try and tread a fine line between belief and debunking, and to try and point out that there's far, far more to the UFO phenomenon than what we consider to be the naive interpretation put on it by some people that they're actually from outer space. There are several other explanations, and in this talk I want to go over briefly the history of ufology and dwelling on 1 or 2 themes. Well, we're now nearly at the end of the 20th century, where a lot of people, getting larger every day, living on a very fragile planet, that mystery surrounds us and has always surrounded us ever since people have been on the Earth. And over the past 40 years specifically, the UFO subject has really taken off, and that's why we're all here today. Each of us has a separate viewpoint. Some of us know what the UFO phenomenon is because we've had personal experience which has left us in no shadow of a doubt what's happening, what's going on. Others are sceptics. They look at other people's experiences and they form their viewpoints from that point of view. But at the base of most of our interest in the subject, especially at this time in history, is an underpinning of belief. Everything's based on belief, and especially the belief that ET visitors are coming to this planet. We have no proof of that. And that's the main theme. But how do we know they're alien? We only know it because people tell us. We have no artefacts, we've got no pieces of crashed spaceship, we've got no pieces of alien cadaver. We've got lots of stories about crashed spaceships and lots of stories about alien cadavers, but we haven't got a piece, because if we had, we'd have it here today. Of course, there will be those amongst you who say the government are keeping them quiet, but we'll deal with that later. For the main part, and for the purposes of ufologists, we know that they come from outer space because people have told us, and they tell us through books like this. This is Jimmy Gurr's Flying Saucers from Another World. Not flying saucers from planet Earth or flying saucers from the brain, but flying saucers from another world. We've also been told it by newspapers and TV and the cinema. This is a typical thing from the 1950s, killers from space. You know, you no doubt there why they're here. They are killers from space. And that is a theme echoed by people like Budd Hopkins, who modifies that slightly and alleges that they're here to tamper with our genetic makeup. So, Dave Clark and myself have been investigators for over 20 years, and we've just published the book detailing all our findings, and this is it. If you're aware of the UFO literature and the newspapers, you might be forgiven for thinking that man's belief in aliens from elsewhere is a relatively new belief stemming from around the late 40s, and you'd be very wrong if you thought that. If aliens are visiting us, they've been doing so for an awful long time, and I'd just like you to listen to a short tape illustrating that fact.
Last years of the 19th century, that human affairs were being watched from the time that the world was asleep. No one could have dreamed we were being scrutinized as someone with a microscope studies creatures that swarm and multiply in front of water. Few men even consider the possibility of life on other planets. And yet, across the gulf of space, minds immeasurably superior to ours regarded this earth with envious eyes. And slowly and surely they threw their plans against us.
Now that doesn't come from a Budd Hopkins book or a Whitley Strieber book. It could quite easily have done so. The concerns expressed there are exactly the same as currently being voiced by most UFO investigators in the States, for instance. A lot of aliens looking at us from outer space, totally emotionless and drawing their plans against us. But that, in fact, was written in 1897 and comes from H.G. Wells' science fiction novel, War of the Worlds, and those are, in fact, the opening lines. So anyone who tries to tell you that it's a new phenomenon, that aliens are coming to us now, is completely wrong. People have written about that sort of visitation for a long time. It's just the interpretation which differs. According to the current flock of ET believers, for the past 40 years at least, the Earth and its occupants have been under just this type of scrutiny by real aliens, and aliens who are not very friendly. They're taking humans away against their will and performing medical experiments on them of a most sinister kind, and who show scant regard for human dignity and freedom. And our main speaker, Budd Hopkins, will be dwelling on this type of theory today and tomorrow. We can go back further in time. This is from an ancient Persian text, and it shows beings from space coming to Earth in their interpretation of spaceships. The history books and the mythology books are littered with it, and it's led myself and David to believe that what we are actually dealing with isn't an objective reality, but it's a mythology based on a variety of factors. We don't know exactly what. It's cultural, it's psychological, and it's sociological. But it is a modern mythology, because we have to have mythologies. Every time has a mythology. We can't examine it very clearly now because we're living it. You can't really dissect your own mythologies at the time. The main theme of extraterrestrial visitation is that of abduction. Everyone knows the title, and there's Jenny Randall's book, Abduction, which clearly screams out at the abduction. Over 200 documented UFO kidnappings exhaustively investigated. The reality of an abduction is very strange. It typically comprises of someone being might be visited by lights, or they might have a period of missing time on a journey. But the key points are a period of missing time when they can't remember what happened to them during a point in their life. Also an interrupted journey, but you get the picture. It's a portion of someone's life that they don't know what happened in until later, when it comes back to them either by hypnosis or by ordinary recall. Now, experiences such as this can be found in almost any UFO book, and some witnesses who report abductions report that their reproductive organs have been tampered with, impregnation perhaps taking place, and in some cases pregnancies have been started, later mysteriously terminated, or in fact that the witness has been taken on board a UFO and shown their hybrid child. That's just an illustration to point out the sort of thing that people often report. But none of this is new. It's all extremely old. The abduction proponents of today, with few exceptions, and most of those exceptions are British and sat in this room today, they don't agree with that at all. Missing time accounts are found frequently in folklore texts from every country, and specifically from Britain. The fairies, where are they now? I mean, how many people here have even heard of someone seeing a fairy? Which I think is very few indeed. The fairies did exactly the same thing as UFO aliens are doing today. An account we dug up from 1887 describes how a servant, following his mistress home, didn't arrive until 3 hours later, and he was unable at first to account for this time lapse, and refusing to believe he was late, eventually recounted what had taken place. And I'll read you the exact text from 1887. According to the Reverend Owen, who collated the story, quote, "He observed, he said, a brilliant meteor passing through the air, which was followed by a ring or hoop of fire, and within this hoop stood a man and a woman of small size. When the hoop reached the earth, these two beings jumped out of it and proceeded to make a circle in the ground. As soon as this was done, a large number of men and women instantly appeared, and with the sweetest music that the ear had ever heard, commenced dancing around in the circle. The sight was so entrancing that the man stayed, as he thought, a few minutes to witness the scene. The ground all around was lit up by a kind of subdued light, and he observed every movement of these beings. By and by, the meteor which had first attracted his attention appeared again, and when it reached the spot where the dancing was, the lady and gentleman who arrived in it disappeared in the same manner in which they had reached the place. Immediately after their departure, the fairies vanished from sight, and the man found himself alone and in darkness, and then he proceeded homewards. In this way he accounted for his delay on the way." So that is clear that man was out at night, as are many abduction witnesses. He had a period of missing time which he couldn't account for, and he related, when he got round to it, a story of being visited by something that came through the air as a light. It contained small people, and he stayed with them for a while. To us, that is a cultural interpretation of a UFO abduction. If that man had this experience now, he would be reporting a UFO abduction. Now, very, very few UFO researchers bring in fairy lore into their work at all, and it hasn't been explained, because obviously we don't have fairies now. So Either they were a psychological and cultural phenomenon which has been reinterpreted, or the fairies used to come and visit us and now they've vanished and they've sent a new crew of people. Worth considering. Basically, it's a period of missing time combined with a strange light which resolves itself into a flying object. It illuminates the area, humanoids come and act in an incomprehensible way. So I think there's only such writers as Jacques Vallée have been dwelling on this point of view from a long time, and it needs looking at again, I think. This is just another illustration of how the fairies carried people off. Now the aliens described in folklore, and they are aliens because whether they were genuine fairies or not, they're certainly as alien to the people then as UFO aliens are today, didn't come from outer space, but they came from the Earth itself, and were described in Wales at least as I think it's the Tylwyth Teg. And the world in which they lived, according to the folklorist Evans Vence, was, quote, quite unlike ours, and mortals taken to it by them were changed in nature. If they thus took you away, it would be according to our time for 12 months, though to you the time would appear to be no more than a night. So again, that's a missing time period enshrined in our folklore. Now, I think it's worthwhile saying that in another 50 years, there'll be people giving lectures and they'll be saying, well, those chaps in the 1980s and 90s who thought that the aliens were visiting Earth were just relating folklore, and they'll have something new to relate to us then. Now, contemporary abductees don't always see a UFO, in fact, a flying saucer, craft from other world, as part of their experience. For instance, several of Budd Hopkins' abductees didn't actually encounter a UFO in the air, but chanced upon it on the ground, in exactly the same way as people came across the fairy entrances to the other world, because an abduction, a contemporary abduction, is a visit to another world, and the fairy realms were called the other world, or the Celtic other world. And the other world is frequently described and depicted as a hollow hill, and on the bottom slide there you can see it's a hollow hill on the ground with fairies dancing around it. Now, again, that looks like it could be a landed UFO. Obviously, they didn't know how to draw those sort of things, but it looks like some form of something, a lump on the ground, which you could go into, you'd be surrounded by a subdued light, and it would vanish in the morning. One of Hopkins' witnesses describes the case of an abductee called Angie, who, when under regressive hypnosis, described a active encounter. And the memory is of meeting a small person in the woods, followed by an encounter with a ship. And note that the Angie witness uses the word ship herself, not craft or UFO. Now, she could be referring to ship as in mothership or something like that, but she doesn't say UFO. The UFO interpretation is put on it by UFO investigators who are keen to be with the current mythology that's prevalent in America. Out-of-the-body experiences, near-death experiences, and other types of experience point the way. The Celtic otherworld, the interior of the fairy mound, and the interior of the UFO seem not to be properties of the external physical world, but more to be created by and reside within the human brain. And the percipient enters this altered state of consciousness in some manner. Space, which obviously would draw no attention. And it also could occur an alien village of Medjugorje since 1981. Now, this isn't a UFO account, and you just have to put up with me telling you about it. It is actually a classic experience with the Blessed Virgin Mary, one of the many reported with her over the past few thousand years, and millions of pilgrims have to date visited Medjugorje to observe people meeting divine beings. What they actually see, though, is just children sitting on the ground staring into space. The events at Medjugorje began in June 1981 when two girls saw a bright shining figure in the sky, identifying it immediately as the Madonna. Now, we might think that if they'd seen it in this country, it would have been identified as a spaceman or an alien. You've got to actually know what you're seeing before you can identify it as something. The children returned to the area the next day, and altogether 6 of them saw the vision. As they began to pray, the vision changed from a blurred image, quote, like a haze clearing, into a clear image of the Blessed Virgin Mary herself. On the next day, crowds gathered and all present saw a brilliant aerial light, and the children once again experienced the BVM. A week after the first experience, the visions and aerial lights were still being seen. So on the surface, this might seem to have only a minimal connection with abduction accounts, but in many ways it is exactly the same. It's human contact with a non-physical being. The witnesses at Medjugorje were having what to them was a real experience, objectively real, between several of them. Yet to observers, they were in some form of trance, during which 3 or 4 of them were having an identical or very similar experience. So, even more significantly, the children when observed, were undergoing the experience, acted not as individuals but as a group, staring fixedly at one spot and nodding and speaking as if in communication with a real being, which to them, of course, they were. And the crowds of pilgrims were sustained by the belief in the Virgin Mary. Proponents of the extraterrestrial abduction theory have often used cases in which more than one person is involved and reports of a similar experience to support the objective reality of the claim. The Medjugorje contact refutes the uniqueness of this claim and gives a human base for multi-witness cases of any type of anomalous phenomena. The children at Medjugorje were unequivocal as to the personal reality of their experiences. To them, it was experienced as being objectively real, part of their ordinary consensus reality. But both were obviously internal, subjective experiences and appearing out in the outside world, just as the UFO abductees claim today. But when UFO abduction experiences are put into perspective against observable events, scientifically observable events such as those at Medjugorje, the argument of objective reality begins to crumble. It seems that both types of events are a separate reality, which others can sometimes share and enter, possibly at will through prayer, in the Catholic's case. In an attempt to prove the veracity of the abduction phenomena, several abductees have been psychologically tested by psychologists in the USA, because one of the claims that people make about abductees sometimes is that they're all mad. Quite feasibly, I mean, it's a strange claim to make that you've been taken on board a UFO, and people say, well, they're all mad. In this case, 9 abductees in all were subjected to tests by Elizabeth Slater, a psychologist who had no knowledge of who the people were or why she was testing them, and nor was Dr. Slater interested in the UFO phenomenon. Slater assessed them for basic emotional and psychiatric problems using a battery of well-known personality tests, such as the Recherche Blot and the Minnesota Multiphasic Test. Slater's conclusions were startling, at least for the debunkers. The subjects tested were perfectly normal, and there was little to unite them as a group from the standpoint of overt manifestations of the personalities. In short, they weren't mentally unbalanced, they had undergone some form of experience, just as the Medjugorje ones are, as I'll show you. Like the abductees, tests were also conducted at the children at Medjugorje. It should be noted well here that the tests run abductees can only be implemented after the events, whereas at Medjugorje they tested the people whilst they were seeing the Blessed Virgin Mary. In other words, an anomalous experience was tested whilst it was happening. In one test, a Yugoslavian psychiatrist concluded that all the children who had experienced the Virgin Mary were, quote, absolutely normal adolescents with no psychopathological symptoms. In another, a team of French doctors conducted a series of psychological and physiological tests on the children, deciding that they were collectively having the same experience, with even their eye movements being identical. An auditory test performed on one of the subjects undergoing the BVM experience revealed that a 90 decibel blast only went as far as the cortex and was not reacted to. So although the experience was shared by all the children, it was internal. They had effectively shut off the external world and were drawing on their own internal and possibly transpersonal sources to create the experience which was to them so real. Now, you've got to take it or leave it that there's an analogy there between the Blessed Virgin Mary witnesses and UFO abductees. I personally think the evidence is there that the two experiences are exactly the same. It's just the interpretation which is different. And it also proves that healthy human beings can experience this sort of phenomena. They don't have to be mad, unbalanced or anything. It's part of it's the human natural function to have these experiences under certain criteria, whether that's induced or accidentally entered into. So here we have a group of normal, well-adjusted individuals having a collective experience of a non-human being, which to them was tangibly real. Matching exactly the claims of the abductee researchers. But rather than ascribing the encounter to Medjugorje as being an objectively real encounter, the conclusion reached there was that the experiences could not be explained by science, and lost for any form of current scientific framework in which to describe the events. The scientist's final report described the experience as being, quote, intense active prayer, partially disconnected from the exterior world, and state of contemplation and healthy communication with a definite person with whom only they can see and touch. So there you have science testing and then admitting that people can create external realities in their minds. It's not a mental illness, there's nothing wrong with it, it's perfectly healthy, and you can all go and practice it tonight. With the results of the test from the Blessed Virgin Mary recipients, the events at Medjugorje becomes of further significance to a search for an explanation for abduction reports. The witnesses there claim to have met non-earthly beings and to have communicated with them. They were not insane or suffering from any form of psychological disorder. And even in this case, there was luminescent aerial phenomena associated with the visions, and one of the children's sisters went so far as to suggest that, quote, maybe they'd seen a flying saucer, like on TV, when first hearing of their encounter. Yet we know that the Blessed Virgin Mary witnesses do not see and touch these beings in the external world, and nor do they move from one spot. So maybe if someone were lucky enough to witness someone who later reported a UFO abduction, they possibly would see a similar thing. And the answer to all this is apparent by looking at the history of alternate states of consciousness. Just as the ideas as to what physical UFOs look like have changed over the centuries, ideas about altered states of consciousness, unless they're kept rigid and trapped in dogma by religion, as in the Catholic case, also change. I don't know where we've gone next here. Oh, we're back to fairies again. Whilst it has been suggested that there is a physiological or neurological basis for why out-of-the-body and near-death experience sensations of floating, detachment from the body and tunnels of light, a great deal of these experiences are learned behaviour, either intentionally through religious belief and practice, or as a result of cultural conditioning of what to expect when in an alternate state of consciousness in particular circumstances. I mean, put simply, this means if you've been fed UFO mythology all your life through the media, books, films, etc., etc., when you enter a different state of consciousness, a different reality, in some circumstances, you're going to have a UFO experience. And this must be the case because, for instance, no one now ever sees fairies, at least in the form described in the 15 and 1600s. And the effect can also be seen in religion, where when altered states of consciousness take place, they often take the form of the traditional Blessed Virgin Mary. It would really be unthinkable for a devout Catholic peasant in a small Italian town, say, to have an American-style abduction with grey aliens, gynecological meddling and that sort of thing. So they have to have an ASC, which results in a vision of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which is acceptable and has been incorporated into their prevailing belief system. Even though the abduction phenomenon is spreading rapidly, there are very, very few reports from Catholic countries such as France, Spain and Italy. Yet there are still many accounts of Blessed Virgin Mary experiences. A famous comprehensive abduction catalogue, which lists more or less the entire world's abductions, done by a guy called Eddie Bullard, only lists 10 alleged abductions from these countries as against the 132 from North America. So is this because people having an altered state of reality interpret it in the accepted mythological terms of their society? Or is it perhaps because the small grey aliens have yet to start visiting Europe in any great number? It could take them a long time to get around America. The reasons why America and the UK lead in the number of abductions is due to a complexity of factors, not least the fact that both cultures are saturated with the myth of extraterrestrial visitation in many forms, and both are in states of religious flux, which are all ideal situations for altered states of consciousness. We're freed now from any form of historical and religious binding, nothing's stopping us, we have no beliefs, we're just free-floating, waiting for something to happen. And we were ready to take on the content of the new mythology and the entry of man into the space age, so it's only natural we should manifest our experiences with aliens. So, if the fairy mound, the Celtic otherworld and the abduction state are the same experience redefined to suit the cultural and personal needs of a community or a town or whatever individuals, what makes them happen and how are they accessed? Merely redescribing and comparing abduction events with other types of other states of consciousness doesn't account for how, if they aren't initiated by real aliens, they take place. In the absence of a suitable mechanism for the initiation of the event, abduction reports are once again open to wild speculation. The only constant in all the experiences is the human mind, and so perhaps, and obviously to my mind, what is being experienced are internal events which take on a different form. But with any alternate state of consciousness, there has to be some form of trigger to effect the change from everyday consciousness. It seems that, like the initiation of near-death experiences and out-of-the-body experiences, no one specific event triggers off any abduction experience, i.e. we can't say to you, go out, do this, and you'll have an experience. A look through any catalogue of abduction cases, though, shows that many are initiated by the sight of a simple light in the sky, perceived later as a UFO, or just perhaps simple bright lights. We shall see in a few minutes how a mundane object can become a UFO. And remember that the BVM visions at Medjugorje was first seen as a hazy light until the intervention of the child's belief system brought in the religious part of the experience. But not all UFO abduction cases begin with the sighting of a light or of a UFO. Many abductees experiences take place while they're in bed, possibly in a liminal state between full waking consciousness and sleep. Many other, quote, paranormal experiences, out-of-the-body experiences, etc., and ghost apparitions among them take place while the witness is in one of the liminal zones between sleep and wakefulness. These are all altered states of consciousness, by the way. Lonely roads are another area of UFO abductions, areas and times when sensory input is at a minimal and highly repetitive level. Whatever repetitive is. This creates an altered state of consciousness which is now medically recognised as highway hypnosis, and there were several cases in the newspapers last year. And when this happens, people cannot remember travelling a certain distance. In other words, they have a missing time period. They don't know what happened over, say, 15 or 20 miles, exactly the same as UFO abductees. Remember also that the lonely countryside and seashore was equally likely in times past to have given rise to a fairy or otherworld experience. Mystics have asserted for centuries that the alternate realities are far more easily accessible when ordinary consciousness is separated from the ties of the physical body. This takes place best when the body is subject to low-level, repetitive stimuli, just as is found in car driving, walking outdoors and in semi-sleep states, all of which are found prior to abduction states. That a change in consciousness takes place in a number of UFO states, and not just abductions, has long been realised by a small number of UFO investigators. Immediately prior to an experience, witnesses often report birds not singing, traffic noise gone, and a strange quietness descending on the area, as though they are literally in a world of their own. Ufologist Jenny Randalls has named this obvious altered state of consciousness the Oz factor, Oz as in, Wizard of, and considered it to be, quote, the mind's way of inducing an artificial form of sensory deprivation so that we pay less attention to normal everyday things out there and tune inward instead. Tuning inward to what, though? The Oz factor is exactly the same type of alternate state of consciousness that people reporting time slips involving ghosts and past lives report, and it's a clear indication to the careful reader and researcher that a change in consciousness is taking place. What shape and content the altered state of consciousness becomes is then dependent on the individual and his or her culture, the needs and expectations. This type of Oz factor in the past was previously described as an enchantment or being under a spell. People, when they met fairies, were glamoured or they were enchanted or they were put under a spell, exactly the same as abductees are today. If one view of the aliens is of the small insectoid type who tamper with our genetic makeup, then a novelist, I suppose he's a novelist, Whitley Strieber has given us another. The same beings, perhaps, in Whitley's accounts, but these creatures have paranormal powers and seem to be involved in all levels of humanity and may share the planet with us, much the same as the fairies do. Everyone thinks that all Whitley's experiences were out and out UFO aliens, but if you read his books carefully, he's not describing the Hopkins type UFO alien at all. He's describing something totally different. Strieber's explanations totally eschews aliens from space, really, and in a recent interview he stated that, quote, I cannot believe that the source of my experience is nothing more startling than visitors from another planet. I suspect that the alien spacecraft imagery is a screen between the individual and the actual experience, which may at this time be impossible or too awesome to comprehend. Whilst never actually stating clearly what his aliens are, Strieber speculates that they, quote, might well seem to be part of our mythology. Perhaps the visitors are the old gods. So here, really, we have a very popular UFO recipient claiming contact with gods who masquerade as aliens. So he's on the ball, but he's not quite there yet. He's a trier. These statements... There they are. They could be coming for you tonight. These statements coming from a man who has spent many years exploring other types of alternate states of consciousness, because a lot of people don't know that Whitley Strieber has been involved in magic, occultism, witchcraft, Gurdjieff belief systems. He's not just coming from the cold, he knows his stuff about this sort of thing. And whose previous books have dealt with nuclear war and magic suggest that his experiences have been caused by internal factors rather than by any form of alien intervention. Strieber's knowledge of alternate states of reality and of human mythology refused to allow him to pigeonhole his experiences as being just aliens, but nor will the sheer imaginative scope of the events related in his books allow him to admit that the possibility that the human mind is at the root of all the experiences. We see this as the nature of a truly transpersonal experience, because even though it takes place directly to individuals, it is thought too awesome and relevant, too significant in fact, because of its strength. not to have an external or controlling force, and it's the root behind all religious belief and mythology. People find it very, very difficult to accept that they are as complex and powerful psychologically as they are. We always like to project things onto some outside force, whether it be God, aliens, the Jolly Green Giant, or whatever. Whether or not his experiences are real, Stryber is ideally placed to spread the new mythology. He writes loads of books, he's on TV, the communion face has been all over Britain and America. And for better or for worse, this is happening, and he's inundated with over 2,000 letters a week from people who claim to have had comparable experiences. But who did they write to before he told them? Stryber seems to have touched deep into the heart of the need for a modern mythology, and gathering together the popular themes of planetary awareness, the Gaia hypothesis and the impending millennium, Stryber has enabled everyone to know that the alien presence is here and to decide how they choose to interpret it. Another quote from him. Sorry, I've got a terrible cold. Perhaps the planet is not just a piece of rock the scientists would have us believe. It could not only be alive but conscious, more even than the scientific version of the Gaia hypothesis. Suppose that not only is the old religion true, suppose it's all true. What if every god and goddess is beginning to tap their feet in concern that we might wake up? I think he knows what's going on, and he's milking it for all he can. With that statement, Stryber has left the world of individual experience behind and clearly made the new mythology open to any interpretation at all. With abductions, clearly something is going on. No one can deny it. Anyone who says people are lying or they're having a psychotic experience is just a duffer who doesn't know what's going on. Abductions are real. They take place. It's the reality that we need to actually work out what is happening. It seems to be belief that causes the event to be described in terms of fairies, aliens or whatever. That an experience of some form takes place is absolutely beyond doubt. It's just the trigger and the nature of the experience that's far from decided. The human mind, as we shall see, is capable of some very, very strange states. Oh, I haven't got to that yet. I'll go back. So that's just a few different versions of the and views of the abduction experience. And we'll leave that behind now, I think, for a while. But why do we now think that today's UFO experience is suffering at the hands of aliens? The actual number of alien abductees is very, very, very small. A few thousand at the absolute most, and that's a few thousand out of the world's entire population. We as ufologists get all het up about it, and we think it's a big thing, but it's not. The man on the street, on the Clapham omnibus, as they say, couldn't give a thingy about ET visitation at all. So it's really fanned by both UFO investigators and the public and media alike. We sort of whisk it all round into a froth that we pass back. We pass the symbols of ufology back between each other, from the press to the media, generally like the TV, back to the ufologists, out in books. We keep it all going. If the people themselves can give us no hard evidence of extraterrestrial visitation other than narrative accounts, so what of other evidence? Photographs, for instance. Thousands of UFO photographs exist, and immediately after this talk, Peter Hough will be showing and talking about a UFO alien photograph, which I'm sure you'll all enjoy better than this talk, and the abduction of the man who took it. But is that proof? Well, sadly it's not. All these things represent the problems we have of UFO investigation and the interpretations behind it, and I'd just like to dwell here in a few photographic cases and a video to point out where these ideas come from. Now, this is my favourite case of all time, because this following case is what really brought me into ufology, and it says everything to me that there is to say in the subject. It's actually gone down in the annals of UFO history, really, and it's known as the Krakow debacle. This is it. This is a UFO. On the 16th of March 1981, 2 police officers saw this thing. Now, a great many UFO authors place stress and kudos on the fact that police officers see and photograph things as if police officers, I know we have some in the audience today, so don't arrest me afterwards, as if they're above the normal foibles of human beings, which sadly isn't the case. They're susceptible to perception like the rest of us. 2 police officers saw this thing hovering below Krakow Fell. Now, this was 1.5 miles from where they saw it from. They'd looked across at this viewpoint every day of their lives for getting on for 2 years, and they'd never seen this before. They watched it for 1.5 hours. They described it on their BUFORA R1 forms as being too bright to look at, like looking into the headlights of a car. Now, this is something 1.5 miles away, so it had to be bloody bright to be dazzling them so much. They whipped inside and got a camera out like sensible lads and took 6 photographs. Great significance was put on the fact that they were police officers, and whilst they were watching it, they thought they could actually see the fin of this craft through the lights. Now, that's open to interpretation, but fair enough, they saw a fin. This took place in an area of North Yorkshire, the South Dales really, where sightings have been happening at an alarming rate for the past few years in 1981, mainly ball of light cases, and quite often UFO cases involving 3 balls of light. And you can see there this little beauty has 3 balls of light, just like the Adamski case. The investigating group, and I'm sorry we have to name names here, were the Yorkshire UFO Society, UFOS, and at the time their members, several of them, thought that there were actually alien bases in the area. And this case became a very big event. There was no explanation for the pictures. They had them analysed and they sent them to ground source of watch in America. Numerous labs in Britain looked at them and they couldn't come up with an explanation. They investigated the case for 2 years, tried everything they could to solve it, and eventually they decided it was a UFO and they went public with it. This was the front cover of the Yorkshire Post, and they knew what it was. It was a UFO over Yorkshire. And needless to say, the investigation proved that it wasn't a star or a planet because it was below the rock face. It wasn't an aircraft because you couldn't get an aircraft against that rock face. You couldn't hover a helicopter there. It was very, very bright lights shining out. It was all over Britain in the media, the television, everything. Visitors from Space, as I think that's the local Cracow paper. And even better, the aliens have landed. This is the picture that UFO spotters claim is definite proof that alien beings have landed on Earth. This case can be extrapolated to all cases. This is what the press... They'd photographed the rock, they'd photographed the phenomenon and totally ignored it. That's it from a bit further away. Very bright, you can understand why it was seen as bright lights coming from a craft. But it wasn't. This is another case that was made out to be something it wasn't. 5th of August 1987... taken by a fisherman called Peter Beard. He took 4 shots which clearly show an object moving across the sky. Lots of people had a look at this. Bruce Maccabee in America, who was a US Navy not physicist, he analyses photographs anyway, and he said that his gut feeling was that it was real, the genuine article. This is someone who works for the US government, mind, saying it's a genuine article. Bear that in mind. It was also a hoax. Well, that's the Daily Star. It was definitely no fake to them. But we sent it to JSW, and they did various analysis on it. And in this case, they were able to come up with the goods. And this is one of many photographs which prove that it was, in fact, just stuck on the window. But that proves that the newspapers will to believe in it being an alien, and even someone like Bruce Maccabee, who was a very well-respected UFO researcher, whose, quote, gut feeling was that it was the real thing. Now, if we're going to leave it to gut feelings to determine whether aliens are visiting Earth or not, we're in for a bad time. I'd just like to show you something that's come into our possession very, very recently, and this is typical of what really the subject's about. It's a video. It was taken in an auditorium. It was taken by someone testing the video camera for the first time, and it moves very slowly across the sky. You can see something that appears to lean out of the top of it and go back in. We studied it for quite a few hours. It appears to be moving very slowly and drifting. It's not a paper bag or a bin bag because the protuberances that come from it are straight and very stiff. It's not being blown by the wind. There's no buffeting effect. It moves across the sky for about a minute all told, and in a moment you'll be able to see how it comes up against the building to actually prove that it is at a distance and it's not easily hoaxed. It's not your saucer-shaped craft. It's it's got no windows, little green men leaning out. But this is the typical sort of thing that we deal with as UFO investigators. Now, depending on who got hold of this video, it could be made out to be anything. Because it doesn't look like a UFO, a classic shape, perhaps we could say it comes from the 4th dimension, which is an easy get. There you can see it's at a distance. It's not held below anything. It's not a balloon or something like that. There he's just trying to get a reference point for it. And now you can see it moving against a building. This is the first public showing of this video, I hasten to add, and we know nothing about it as yet. If it's a hoax, it's a very good hoax. So if you're going to suggest, shout them out by all means. And it's slowly indeterminate, as is the distance. I mean, we will have it properly looked at, as they say. age is very, very suspicious. Cast your minds back to the event. Well, it's not aerodynamically shaped though. For something to be flown, it usually has to have some aerodynamic capabilities, otherwise it wouldn't fly very well. And as you can see, it is holding a smooth course. It's not. I think it must have been Slipper of the Yard who got to grips with the phenomena, and he. Well, I am actually paid by the CIA. I'm sorry, I hope I haven't mocked and ridiculed. I mean,
well, I think you did. You made people laugh, actually.
There's nothing wrong with people. If we can't make people laugh at ufology, we might as well give it up. But this is life. We've got to, treat it like treat everything else. It's not the end of the world, if you pardon the pun. And speaking of the CIA, I have in my book here a memorandum written in 1952 where Walter B. Smith, the director of the CIA, states that I suggest that we discuss at an early board meeting the possible offensive or defensive utilisation of these phenomena for psychological warfare purposes. So, reading UFO government documents is selective, but that to me implies that they knew that there was a UFO mythology, and they thought, well, right, let's get on the beam here and let's utilise it for our own ends, just the same as they did with they have done with other things, just the same as the British Army did in. The Americans did in Vietnam, where they utilised the native beliefs there to make people think that the helicopters were creatures from mythology and things like that. Ufology is not simple. It isn't what you read in the books at all, except for this one, of course.
Time for one last question. The gentleman at the back.
What do you think about the Belgian inquiry about that triangle spacecraft?
I don't know. It's
Belgian inquiry about that triangle spacecraft.
I don't know. It's extremely similar, if not identical, to a flap that we had in West Yorkshire 2 years ago now, and that did turn out to be aeroplanes. I don't know. I'm not a Belgian person. I haven't investigated it, so I can't comment.
And also, was it up to date inquiry about the shuttlecraft? What amateur radio did that take?
Well, I can't comment on that because it's a very long and convoluted story. Maybe hoax. But to get back to your point about the Belgian thing, if people are seeing something that isn't an aeroplane that misperceived or something like that, again, all they're seeing are lights in a triangular shape. It could be any form of craft, and even if it's a craft, that's not saying where it comes from. I think ufologists are far too quick to say, it comes from outer space, the Pleiades, wherever. We just don't know that. It's complete rubbish. It's mythology. Yes, sir.
What's your own personal views on the whole subject? What do you think of it?
Well, I thought I was giving them there, but...
actually just bouncing about.
No, my personal view is that it's all a human conjured thing, but it's not just humans, it's our interaction with our society. Well, there's nothing wrong with psychology.
It's a psychological meeting, is it? So
No. I rest my valise entirely on that quote,
I'm sorry to interject there. I think the argument could go on long into the night. I'd like to thank Andy for upsetting half of the audience.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm sure we'll be quite happy about that. To coin up a well-known phrase, now we're going to have something slightly different, not completely different. To say that UFO photographs are quite uncommon, to say that photographs of alleged entities or beings is even rarer is quite an understatement. What a lot of people don't know is that just 3 years ago, and just shorter than 3 years ago, an alleged entity, being, call it what you will, was photographed in West Yorkshire, in fact on Ilkley Moor. Now, the vast majority of the investigation into this particular photograph has been done by our next speaker, who is Mr. Peter Hough. Peter is the chairman of the well-respected Manchester UFO Research Association, needless to say, based in Manchester. Peter is also a well-known author and is co-author with Death by Supernatural Causes, along with his colleague Jenny Randall. And I'm going to look here. Copies again are available in the foyer outside. I shan't say any more.
You will.
I will. I'll keep going. Peter has been involved with this case for a number of years now. I would say it's quite little known perhaps in this country. For example, how many people in this audience today knew that this particular photograph existed? He talks over. But not a lot. It is quite extraordinary. The interest in the interest in the photograph has been spread worldwide. But we would like to give Peter the opportunity today to present all the facts on the case and bring everyone up to the date on this most interesting and unusual of cases. Peter Hough, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm about to upset the other half who haven't been upset by Andy. Here's some fairies. Very relevant point, as you will see later, and I hope you're all relaxed, but not quite as relaxed as this little fella here, because he's nodded off. I don't want to do that just yet. I'm going to tell you a modern fairy story, and the location of this one is on Ilkley Moor. This is an area known as White Wells, and these buildings here were a local baths for the residents of Ilkley during the last century. A local landowner bequeathed the baths to the local population. I'll come back to that later on. These trees here is where a very unusual and very highly important case emerged. Philip Spencer is a former police officer, and he set off at around 7:15 one morning from his home in Ilkley. And very roughly he took this route here. December the 1st, 1987. It was quite dark at that point. He was visiting some relatives who lived in a village on the other side of the moors. He enjoyed walking. In fact, he was an experienced potholer, so he thought the walk would do him good. He continued his journey, roughly in this direction, past this stand of trees, and over the top of the hill. In the hill is a very deep and wide pit. As he was walking past it, something caught his attention from this side, and he stopped and spun round. And about 10 feet away from him, he saw what he describes as a small green creature. He was carrying a camera and a compass. The camera was there, he said, to take some photographs of Ilkley from the moor tops. But seeing this thing, he automatically brought the camera up, and by the time he'd done that, the creature was then about 40 feet away, and he took one snap. And this is the resultant picture. The creature, which he later described as having very rough green skin, had long arms and 3 digits on each hand, and no opposable thumb. The feet too are interesting, and I'm sure Andy Roberts will find this quite intriguing. They were cloven. They were just like 2 big toes and nothing else. You can't really see a great deal of detail here, but according to him, the thing had quite large ears, large round eyes, no nose that was discernible, but a slit of a mouth. This arm, you can see, reached virtually down to the level of the legs. This one is crooked because, according to him, the thing was making a dismissive motion as if to say, go away. But Philip jumped down into the pit after this creature, which moved at a very fast rate, much quicker, he described, than any human being, and in a fraction of a second had disappeared behind this buff. It isn't very clear here, but there's a line here which marks an outcropping. And behind the outcropping is a much deeper well in the road, in the ground. Philip ran around the buff. The creature had gone, but there was a hovering disc, like two saucers or soup bowls, edge to edge. And there was a box-like something which was just disappearing into the top of it. The thing suddenly went, and the entire experience, according to him, lasted no more than 30 seconds, from originally seeing the creature to seeing the UFO disappear up into the sky. Now, something of significance I want to point out to you on this photograph, which I shall come back to later, is this blob here. Just bear that in mind, because that is in roughly about the right place to where possibly this box-like structure was before it disappeared into the top of the object. This is in fact looking down into the deeper pit where the object was allegedly hovering. I think it's a place that must be used from time to time by campers, because when we went and investigated there was the remains of old campfires and so on. But this was where the disc was hovering. He in fact was standing over here in this direction. He didn't continue his journey. He was very bemused, worried, and he went back into Ilkley, and there a further surprise awaited him. Bearing in mind he set off at approximately 7:15 in the morning, the experience occurred about half an hour into his walk. That brings us to 7:45. The experience, according to him, only lasted 30 seconds, so it was a half an hour's walk back. It should have been 8:15, but all the shops were open and there was shoppers about, and the church clock told him it was 10 a.m. He was now beginning to wonder if he was going mad, and he was wondering if there'd been anything there at all, but perhaps he'd hallucinated the entire affair. But he knew he'd taken a photograph. So he caught a bus to Keighley, which is the nearest town, which he remembered had a processing place which had a 1-hour service. He took the film in, and 1 hour later he picked the film up and knew about these things. And he remembered that his parents, who didn't live in the area, had a book on UFOs, and that there was addresses in the back of it. And in the back of the book was an address for Jenny Randall's, and he wrote to her. But he was trying to hide his identity to some extent, because the address on the letter was a box number. He was very, very wary of the details coming out about the case, and the whole thing possibly being in the media and him connected with it. So in the first instance, at that time, he used a box number, and Jenny immediately replied. Unfortunately, the box number was not in Ilkley, so it would be a matter of a week or so before he would pick up her letter. In the meantime, he was getting more and more unnerved and upset that he needed to talk to someone, and he went down to the local library where they had a list of individuals and societies, and found a phone number for a gentleman called Arthur Tomlinson, and phoned him up. Tomlinson and someone else called Steve Ballon, and it's very unfortunate that Steve Ballon became involved in the case, but they went up and they interviewed the witness. Arthur Tomlinson then gave me a ring and started telling me about the case, and I stopped him midway and said, I know about this. Jenny's reply to his letter. So it was arranged that the following evening I go up there and interview the witness too and visit the location. Very unusual photograph, a very strange photograph, yet not quite clear enough. And the first thing that sprang to my mind was that the whole thing was a hoax. And you have to put these questions to witnesses. It's no good passing the buck and just asking nice questions that the witness wants to hear, so they can give you perhaps the sort of answers that you want. I put it to him quite early on into the interview that he'd perhaps built some kind of foam rubber dummy, taken it up to the moors and taken a photograph of it, and then concocted a nice little story to go with it, because there was another element too. There was the compass, which was now reversed. Instead of pointing north, it pointed south. So that was another little bit of anecdotal evidence that something strange had occurred. Philip wasn't upset by my question. He just shrugged his shoulders and said, I honestly don't see the point in that. Why would I want to do something like that? I've got better things to do with my time. We got him to fill in a standard R1 form, and you can see this. It's got a little drawing. As you can probably tell, he's not the best artist in the world, but it does give you some indication of his memory of the entity. And you can see quite clearly here the ears and the large eyes, which were black incidentally, no pupils. The very long thin arms and the long thin legs. And also notice, and this is also obvious on the photograph, that the legs do not come to a V in the middle. It's as if they're joined on either side of the body. There's the saucer, and his very brief and concise account. When walking on Ilkley Moor, I noticed a movement and saw a creature moving away from me. I shouted, "Hey!" and the creature turned and seemed to wave me away. I photographed it, and it then turned and continued moving away. I ran after it, and after turning a corner, I came upon a silver-coloured saucer-shaped object. A box-shaped object disappeared into the top of the saucer, and the saucer rose quickly, straight up into cloud, accompanied by a humming noise. There were certain things we could do with this case, and we were determined to do follow certain lines of investigation. We had the compass, and it was a typical walker's compass. The entire magnet was enclosed in a fluid, so there was no evidence that it had been tampered with, because one theory we came up with was that it had been taken apart, and the actual magnet had been painted the opposite way around to make it appear, to be reversed. We took it to the University of Manchester to see a Dr. Spooner, and he's head of the electrical engineering department there, and had agreed to have a look at the compass for us. In the first instance, he tried using some very quite powerful magnets, and although these... But what we wanted to know was, could Joe Bloggs or Philip Spencer in the street have brought this about, or did one need specialist laboratory equipment to do it? And after further experimentation, it was realised that it could have been done at home. This is the report. Actually, it's the Institute of Science and Technology. It appears to be a relatively simple matter to bring about the reversal without the need for any special equipment, and may be accomplished easily in the average home or garage. All that Ed Spooner did, actually, in the end, after about 2 or 3 hours of trying different experiments, was to coil a wire in his hand, attach the ends to a terminal to the main supply, sit the compass in this coil, throw a switch, and the needle reverse polarity. Of course, it would be very dangerous to do this in your home. You would blow a fuse at the very least, or you may even cause an electrical fire. But the effect could still also be brought about by using a battery. At that time, Ed Spooner thought that it needed to be a pulsed field. A steady field had no permanent effect. But we did discover at a later date, using some very powerful industrial magnets which are manufactured in Japan, that it was able to permanently reverse the needle just using an ordinary magnet. But I hasten to add that these magnets, there's no way really that Philip Spencer would have access to them. They'd just been produced in Japan. And as far as using his home or garage, would he have had the knowledge to have done this when Dr. Spooner, who's an expert in his field, at the start of the experiment didn't quite realise how easily the effect could be brought about? He also suggests at the bottom of the report that a magnetic survey should be carried out of the area, and this would go some way to proving the case. Of course, at that point, we thought that if the case was genuine, that the effect had been brought about by... There'd been a knock at the door. He answered the door, and two men were standing there, dressed in business suits, around 40 years of age, and they said they were from the Ministry of Defence, and produced cards, identity cards, which to him at least seemed to prove that was the case. He invited them into the house, and they asked him questions about his UFO sighting. He was so taken aback that he never asked them how they knew about the sighting, because at that time there was only 4 people, apart from the witness, who knew about it. And at that point at least, we'd been very careful to keep it all quiet while we were carrying out various enquiries. He said at times their behaviour was a little bit strange. They seemed to be fascinated by his electric fire and one or two other things in the room which we all take for granted. One of them did most of the talking. The other one, he can't really remember asking him any questions at all. Now, I told him quite rightly that I didn't think that anyone had passed on any details to the MOD, and of course I was very familiar with other cases where strange men had turned up at witnesses' houses claiming to be officials and who have become known as the Men in Black, which sounds quite melodramatic. The thing about the Men in Black is usually you tend to get additional witnesses which aren't there to a UFO sighting or a UFO abduction. And in this case too there was another witness. There was the witness's wife, who didn't take part in any of the questioning because she was getting her young children bathed and ready for bed. But she has verified to me that 2 men did call at the house and 2 men did ask her husband questions, and then they departed. Now, you may be forgiven for thinking that his wife might support him anyway, but I don't think really that's the case. I think out of all of this case, that is the one thing that I accept, and that is that 2 men called at the house. I have interviewed the lady several times. She's a very nice lady, and I don't think really she'd want to get involved in this by lying for her husband, which is what it would amount to. She's also a very fervent Christian, so that's whether that has anything to bolster her integrity or not, I'm not sure. But I must admit that I am quite satisfied that 2 men did call at the house, because she supports it, and I think she can be relied on. Of course, we had the photograph too, and we decided to see what we could do with that. First of all, we took it to Tony Marshall, who in fact lives in Sheffield. He may even be in the audience, I don't know. Is he? No? Good. We went to... no, I'm not going to say anything bad about Tony. Tony is a professional wildlife photographer. He's a very skilled photographer. He gets commissions which send him all over the world, taking photographs for big glossy calendars and magazines and so on. And we took the negative and the print to him, and he wasn't very impressed with it. He said, "Why do all these photographs always have to be blurred and underexposed?" He says, "I find that highly suspicious. In my opinion, the photograph has deliberately been rigged that way so that you can't quite identify that the creature is nothing more than some sort of dummy made out of foam rubber or whatever. I pointed out to him too the blob-shaped thing and asked him what he thought that was, and he seemed to think it was some flaw in the negative. Anyway, not satisfied with that, I then took it to a company in Rochdale, a screen printers who have a very good photographic department, and they too were very sceptical about it. I think really it's a gut feeling because, I mean, let's face it, a photograph like that just can't be genuine, can it? They thought that it wasn't the genuine photograph, that in fact it was a photograph of a photograph, because there seemed to be a slight flaring at the bottom. And finally, the negative was examined by Peter Sutherst at Kodak. This is a bit I forgot to mention. I'll mention that after. Kodak, at the time when I spoke to Peter on the phone, he was going on about doing some computer image enhancement, because they do have those facilities at Kodak, and he seemed to be quite excited about it. Anyway, I sent him the negative and a print, and he gave it the photograph. It was the negative was the genuine negative of something which was photographed on the moors. It wasn't a superimposition. What was in the photograph was actually there on the moors. Obviously, we still don't know what it is. I'll go back to this now. Yes, I wrote to the Ministry of Defence for several reasons. First of all, to see if they'd had any reports made to them by other independent witnesses of someone perhaps seeing a disc disappearing into the sky, because they are fairly good these days. If you can actually give them the details of a sighting, they will check to see if they've had any reports. In this case, as you can see, they did not have any reports. I also wrote to them about the visit by the two men, and my letter was totally ignored. I then wrote a second time, that was ignored, and then finally I did get a reply where they said that it wasn't their policy for Ministry of Defence officials to interview UFO witnesses. The witness remembered the full name of one of the men on the card and the partial name of another, and I included these names in the letter and said, is there anyone who works for the Ministry of Defence with these names? Now that part of my letter was totally ignored. I did give them a description of the identity card, and they said that this was not the description used, this was not the layout of a card used by the MOD. So we got absolutely nowhere with that. We decided to go upon the moors and take some measurements, because you can't really see, you can't really tell the size of this thing. I mean, it could be an Action Man type, doll type thing stuck in the grass and photographed. Incidentally, this isn't a path, it's just, this is all a sort of mossy type material, and this is, for some reason, this is a lighter shade, which makes it appear that it's a path, but it's not a path. Anyway, we went up on the moors and took some measurements. And this isn't another alien, by the way. This is me and my silver wellies. So, but you can see, although there was no obvious source of Freudian slip, of illumination. That is also something which has emerged from time to time in abduction cases. There was some sort of table in the middle of the room, surprise, surprise, and Philip Spencer kept hearing a voice in his head saying, "Do not be afraid, do not be afraid." He was then ordered to go and lie down on the table, which he did do, and then he was surrounded by 4 or 5 of the green creatures. And at that point, a very bright horizontal beam of light, very similar to a fluorescent tube, came down over his body, following the contours of his body, along his feet and up his body and over his chin and over his head. He was then told, because he heard everything in his head, that he could get up and he was to follow one of the creatures. He was given a conducted tour of the object, and there again that's something which has emerged time and time again. And what really threw him was when he was in the corridor and there was a porthole, and through the porthole he could see the planet Earth. In fact, this was so surprising that even under hypnosis he didn't actually say what it was until he was reminded of it during interview later. In fact, his exact comments were, he was very embarrassed about telling us what he saw, and afterwards he says, "It's a good job the entire case sounds ridiculous, isn't it?" He was then taken into a room which, if you want to use science fiction terms, was some sort of engine room. There was a gyroscopic implement in the middle, and he was on a walkway with one of the entities, and this thing was spinning around. And as it span round, he saw that his camera and the compass were drawn towards this thing. They then left that room and went into another, where he was shown what one can describe as two films. He says they were like images on a wall, and he's wondering, under hypnosis, how did they get their images? So it wasn't a straightforward film on a screen. The first film showed the planet Earth, and it showed pollution much worse than it is now. It showed millions of dead fish floating in the sea, poisoned rivers, people starving all over the world, and not just in the African countries. All these images he saw and went into his mind as though it was a warning. He was then shown another film, and I'm sorry, but we do not know the contents of this, because neither under hypnosis nor consciously afterwards would he tell us. It seems it was a very personal film for himself, and when we asked him, well, why won't you give us some indication of the contents, he says, well, the only way I can put it across to you is this. There's certain things that you know about your wife or your girlfriend which you would never tell anyone else. He says, and that's how I feel about the second film. It is very intimate. Things became very silly when Steve Ballon, who you may remember, was involved right at the start of the case, went to the press with it. Now, he knew that the witness didn't want this to happen, and we had all agreed to keep the thing very quiet, but unfortunately this didn't stop him, and the case was entirely rubbished in the Star, which is what you'd expect. I mean, who's going to believe anything after reading it in the Star anyway? What's that? It's a scared little alien, claims Steve, meaning Steve Ballon. They also used the photograph without permission because it's copyrighted, but that's by the by. The account, there's a lot of facts missing out of the account. It's a garbled story which Steve Ballon gave them. But the Star went a step further. They explained the whole case away, and so for the last half hour or so, I'm sorry, but I've been wasting your time, because all we needed to do was show this slide at the start, and there you are, bingo. It's all explained. Is it a man from Mars? No, it's the man from the Crew. And here he is, Jack Mchale. I mean, this wasn't even photographed on Ilkley Moor, but 10 out of 10. He's very clever. There's a suitcase. And he's posed, actually, if he put his green suit on, it might have matched well, but then they weren't showing the photograph in colour anyway. According to the story, this guy, Jack Mchale, has come forward and said, it was me, I did it. And they did an action replay. Now, absolute rubbish. I've spoken to Jack Mchale, and so did Arthur Tomlinson. And Jack admits that it wasn't him in the original photograph, and he's never pretended otherwise. Jack has a reputation for being a practical joker. And when two of his colleagues saw the original story in the Star, they decided to get their own back on Jack and phoned the Star up and said, "We know who the alien is. It's our colleague Jack, who visits a few of the farms on Ilkley Moor." So the Star got into touch with Jack, and they said, how about getting involved in a little prank? So he said, why not? Apparently they offered him 50 quid, and he was very, very sore about that when I spoke to him, because they hadn't coughed up the money. So there you are. Never trust tabloid newspapers. Remember this suitcase, because it'll crop up again, but remember that the suitcase is in the left hand. Computer image enhancement. If you remember, Kodak didn't think it was worth the effort. It's all been tried in Japan, and that didn't clarify the picture, waste of time. But the British Journal of Photography decided they'd have a go at it. Geoffrey Crawley actually did the work, and maybe one or two of you are familiar with his work into the Cottingley Fairies hoax. He was instrumental in exposing that, and he thought he'd have a crack at the Ilkley picture, and the results were published in a February issue this year of the British Journal of Photography. Now, this is what I mean by how useless image enhancement is in this particular case. All you've got is a more grainier picture. Maybe you've got something there that may be a mouth, perhaps that's an eye. I wouldn't like to say really. That's part of the arm, the other arm. So it doesn't really prove anything. In fact, it only makes it harder to see. But look at this, another suitcase. But this suitcase isn't in the left hand. That suitcase is in the right hand, according to Geoffrey Crawley. So you've obviously got an alien wandering around Ilkley Moor with a suitcase in either hand. Because the Daily Star have spotted one of them and Geoffrey Crawley spotted the other. A piece of very good research was done by Andy Roberts and Philip Mantle. Well, that's an artist's interpretation of the photograph. The artist examined the picture under high magnification, and according to him, this is the details he can see. I just put this in, I don't know, I thought it might amuse you. I mean, I can't see those details, but there we are. Anyway, let's get on to the next thing. Yeah. Remember the blob, which seems to perhaps fit in with the recipient's description of a box-like something disappearing into the top of the object. Now, I've given one or two talks, and I've always pointed this out. I never said that I thought that was the box going into the top of the object, but I think quite rightly I've pointed it out, because the witness said he saw a box, and here you have a vaguely square-shaped blob, which is in roughly the right place where a box may have been that was disappearing into the top of an unidentified flying object. I'd taken lots of photographs of the site, and I didn't spot anything unusual. But Philip Mantle and Andy Roberts went up there a week or so before the anniversary of when the photograph was taken. And actually there on the morning of the anniversary took lots of photographs, and on one of them they came up with something very interesting. If I can find it. There. Can you see that? That is a basically square shape, which is in the actual far bank of the buff. If you remember, this line here is where the buff juts out, and behind this buff is a deeper well where the object. But it is in exactly the right place, and it does explain that away. There's no doubt about it. That does explain where that came from. Why doesn't it appear on lots of photographs? Andy's got the opinion that the lighting has to be exactly right. The lighting has to mirror exactly the the conditions of the anniversary, the year before when the entity photograph was taken. It has to be the right time of the year. I mean, most of the photographs I took were around March, April. And probably it has to be the right time of the year so that the moisture content is right in the ground for reflecting the light significantly for this to show up. And of course, the conditions have to be right. The sky is very overcast, as it was on the day when the original photograph was taken. So all these things combined show this up. It has to be said, though, that Philip Spencer has never, ever pointed at the blob on the photograph and said, "This is the box that I saw disappearing into the object." Because, of course, it would be quite natural to assume, and this is quite a terrible thing to say, that after he'd hoaxed the photograph, he noticed a square blob and decided to incorporate that into his story to further enhance the case. But he has never pointed at the blob and said that. But of course, perhaps he's so clever he's left it for someone else to spot, and that person who spotted it was me.
Well, certainly this last decade, that it is our next speaker. He is the author of Missing Time and a better known book, certainly in this country anyway, Intruders. I won't say any more, but I'd like you to welcome Budd Hopkins.
Well, thank you very much. I think I unwired myself here a minute ago. I'm very sorry to have arrived late through all kinds of misunderstanding. I never knew how potent jet lag could actually be. But according to me, I think it's still 1937 in my mind. That's a serious case. What I'm going to do, first of all, is start with some slides, because I do agree about the relative merit of pictures and words. I'm an artist by profession, so naturally that has to be my point of view. They are worth a lot more. We're going to look at some of the material that's background to the Kathy Davis case and many other related abduction cases, background in different aspects of the physical evidence for UFO abductions. At the beginning, I'd like to say that about the phenomenon that I don't approach this from the point of view of theory. I pick this up simply by the human end, what people tell me they've experienced, what's happened to them, what doctors will tell me seems to be an artifact of some experience that's a little peculiar medically to explain, etc. Whether the UFO occupants are meta-terrestrials, time travelers, interdimensionals, whatnot, isn't of prime concern to me. I think the wheel-spinning aspect of that question came out very well when a researcher named Scott Rogo, who's done some very good work on this subject, said in an article, something I think he since regretted. He said, clearly UFO occupants are not extraterrestrial because they're not doing what extraterrestrials would do. I think at that point I asked him if he had gone down to the Bureau of Standards in Washington and taken out the extraterrestrial and checked out its IQ, etc., etc. It's almost impossible to get outside the framework of our own obvious anthropomorphic understanding and reach. We go to ourselves, and it's very, very hard to go beyond that. So I don't really make that attempt. So when people tell me that something has happened to them that makes medical sense or psychological sense or whatnot, to them as something that occurred, I'll accept that without being able to ask the ultimate questions. Why is that happening? And by whom is it occurring? Is it being inflicted on people? Those questions we really don't know. I don't know what the bottom line is of this entire UFO phenomenon, but I can say with assurance, based on years of investigation, that it is, at least some of the time, intensely physical. It is so physical that it can do things to the ground and to people's bodies and to the shrubbery, etc., and can turn up on photographic film, radar, and so on. At the same time, it has a psychic aspect, whatever we want to call that. I am standing here, a rational human being, I think, and telling you that in many cases people are floated through closed windows or walls or whatnot. It's a pretty wild idea. This is not an out-of-body experience, although those things may be involved in this phenomenon. I call it an out-of-the-house experience. We have a lot of human terms. We talk about people who have had these repeated experiences now as people on the frequent flyer plan, which is out of airlines. It's an unfortunate thing, and it's something I try not to really joke about, but you're forced to, because in the wake of the abduction phenomenon is a great deal of psychic injury. There's no argument about that. The physical problems exist, but certainly the psychological problems are even worse, even more widespread. Now, I work in New York with a number of psychiatrists, psychologists, and others who are extremely involved in the subject and who are the first ones to say that this does not fit any psychological model of standard psychological illness or problems or whatnot, that something new is occurring without any doubt. And at this point, I've now had 3 psychiatrists and 4 psychologists and a number of psychotherapists come to me because of their own abduction cases, and I have carried out hypnosis with these people. I have had many different psychiatrists and psychologists, skeptics, quote-unquote believers, whatever that means, and others doing hypnotic regressions in these experiences with other people. It makes no difference who really does it. That has been established beyond any doubt by Edward Bullard in his study of the material that I have turned up as opposed to other people in the field doing this kind of work. People forget that all of my work is based on 8 years of working with other psychiatrists, psychologists, other than myself. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, but other people who were doing the hypnosis, and they came up with the material on which all of my work is based. And a number of them were quite skeptical at the very beginning of this. It has nothing to do with belief. It has nothing to do with the personality of the investigator or the hypnotist. The material that comes out and cannot be bent. At the very end of this presentation, I'm going to play a little hypnotic regression tape, a section of it, just to give you a feeling of what this is all about. Now, if we can have the first slide, please, if the machine is ready. Just to begin with a very pretty UFO picture. This happened to be taken in New Zealand and the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago at the time. It was out at the Northwestern with Alan Hynek, at least in Evanston, Illinois now. It's back in business in Chicago. But they have analyzed this photograph very thoroughly. I won't go into it in any detail. It just kind of establishes a nice-looking